Well, today marks World Toilet Day, a day declared by the United Nations and dedicated to highlighting the importance of providing adequate sanitation. This, of course, is in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which calls for sanitation and clean water for all by 2030. It's also one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. Now, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, about 4.2 billion people do not have access to properly managed sanitary toilets. South Africa has, over the past few years, experienced alarming water and sanitation issues, with several communities without access to clean drinking water, sewage issues and adequate toilet facilities. Schools, in particular, have also been at the receiving end of poor sanitary infrastructure, where many in the country still use pit latrine toilets. Well, for more on this and how far the country at least has come, we speak to Equal Education Head of National Organising, Zanele Modise, and Commissioner Philile Ntuli, who is with the South African Human Rights Commission. A warm welcome to both our guests. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Commissioner, I'd like to start with you. I mean, you heard that harrowing statement about 4.2 billion people on the planet not having access to proper sanitation, not having access to clean drinking water. Clearly a sanitation crisis. South Africa is not immune, though. How far do you think we've come when it comes to our own imperatives around sanitation?
Good morning, Dokozo, and good morning to the viewers. Thank you very much for inviting us to your show this morning and shining the spotlight on this very important issue of sanitation in South Africa. Now, to understand the status of sanitation in South Africa, it's important to place it within its regional context in particular. You've placed it within its global context. According to UNICEF, more than 70% of the population in the eastern and southern regions of Africa, which is about 340 million people, have no access to basic sanitation services. Amongst these, about 19% practice open defecation. More than half of that use unimproved facilities, and about 63 million use shared sanitation services. Ethiopia in particular, Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania have by far the largest number of people in the region with no access to basic sanitation services, while countries like Eritrea, South Sudan and Ethiopia have the largest proportions and numbers of people practicing open defecation. Now, moving specifically to South Africa, the South African government has made important strides towards addressing both sanitation as well as water supply backlogs since 1994. South Africa has, for example, achieved the Millennium Development Goals of having the number of people without access to sanitation or halving the number of people without access to sanitation by 2008. In 1994, more than 50% of households didn't have access to sanitation, one of the terrible legacies of apartheid, which were inherited by the democratic state. By 2010, this was reduced to 21% of households. Currently, in 2022, about 65% of South Africa's population have access to waterborne sanitation, such as flushing toilets, which are connected to a sewer network, septic tanks or conservancy tanks. There's another about 19% that have ventilated, improved pit latrines, and about 13% that have pit toilets with no ventilation pipes. The remaining population either have poor flush toilets, chemical toilets, or composting toilets, or they use buckets. And we can speak about the bucket toilet system in particular later during this interview, as it's one of the issues that the South African Human Rights Commission is playing or is paying a lot of focus on. Unfortunately, in Dogozo, about 1% of the population still practice open defecation because they have no access to any sort of toilet facility. And most importantly and lastly, the differences in access between the urban and rural populations is still very stark, and it continues to be a challenge in the post-1994 era.
Well, okay, so Commissioner, the sense I get from you is that while there has been some progress made on the sanitation front, we still have 1% of South Africans, 1% too many, practicing open defecation, and that speaks to issues around human dignity. As a person, it's not okay. I think we can all agree that one should be exposed to such a standard of living. And I do want to bring Zanele into the conversation at this point because your organization, Equal Education, has been quite instrumental in holding government accountable with regards to its own efforts, its own promises in eradicating pit latrines in our schools. Talk to us about whether or not you think any progress has been made on that front.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for having me. So on this question, I mean, there's no denying that there has been change that schools have seen. However, it has been happening at a slow pace, and schools that, are still in dire conditions need to see this change happen urgently. And this is what Equal Education has been advocating for in the province. And in terms of slow progress that we've picked up is that, the NEEMS reports between 2016 to 2021 reflect that only 700 schools were provided with appropriate sanitation in 5 years. Now you can imagine how many schools are left behind. And in terms of data and how we've seen in Limpopo is that there has been conflicting data from the NEEMS report, from the implementation report, and also from the norms and standards report. So if you don't have reports and plans that are speaking to each other in terms of numbers, and there is conflicting data, then it's going to make, it's going to delay the process of actually eradicating the sanitation backlogs in the province. And that is what we have picked up as Equal Education, and that, the department has missed, important deadlines. So the 2016 and 2020 deadline, the 2016 deadline says schools must be provided with some form of sanitation and water supply. And by 2020, school must have adequate, water and sanitation. And, so we've seen that has been happening at a slow pace. And during our school visits, we've also noticed that, children are still releasing themselves in open air. And that speaks to your point that you were saying around, dignity. So if you are having to release yourself in open air, what does that mean of your dignity? But we have been seeing change in schools, and that's why this report that we are going to be launching today actually, is quite important, because it's a comparison to what we have seen, in 2017 and what we have seen just before lockdown in 2020, and the, experiences that, the school community in Limpopo has been faced with. But there has been change. It has been happening at a slow pace. And we are constantly thinking about the schools that, have to contend with not having, a dignified sanitation and not having, adequate water supply. Because we've had testimonials from, principals that have been saying, listen, if we don't have access to water, we send school kids early to their homes, and that, hinders on the, teaching and learning process. Because if you're having to go home, four times a week because there's no water access, what does that mean, on the process of teaching and learning?
No, absolutely. And I think that's a great segue to bring in the Commissioner back into the conversation. This infringement that we're starting to see on the rights of children to be able to access education. If schools at a provincial level are having to close down the classrooms because they don't have access to adequate sanitation, access to clean drinking water, for pupils, for learners, I mean, that's clearly a violation of a right. How do we address this, given also the fact that you have explained for us, Commissioner, that this is a legacy problem? A lot of the stuff has been inherited over the years, and it's been a slow journey to trying to resolve this issue.
Thank you very much for that question. I would agree with Zanele on the interrelatedness of the rights, and when the right to water and the right to sanitation is violated, then there's a trickle effect on the violation of other rights. when we look at schools in particular, there is a disproportionate effect across the genders. The girls in particular become even more vulnerable, especially those who are reaching puberty. They tend to then miss school more because of an access to sanitation as well as water. There are spreading preventable diseases like diarrhea and cholera in schools because children in particular interact with each other in a differentiated way to adults. When girls then drop out, there is a ripple effect on their ability to then develop themselves and to develop the gender as a whole. There's also then an increase in the use of hospitals and clinics, which puts pressure on the institution as a whole. And people, of course, as Zanele has mentioned, miss work because of this. Now, coming to the direct question of the rights that are violated, you will know, and also that the right to water and sanitation is a fundamental right that is provided for in the Bill of Rights. Chapter 2 of the Constitution in particular provides that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient food and to sufficient water. And in order to give effect to this right, Parliament has enacted the Water Services Act, which is Act 108 of 1997, the purpose of which is to provide for the right to basic water supply as well as basic sanitation services. Right. The Act, amongst others, recognizes the right of access to basic water supply, basic sanitation services, sufficient water, and an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being of people and animals.
Right.
This suggests that everyone has a right to access to basic water. Everyone has a right, and every water services institution and authority has to take steps to realize these rights.
Right.
Now,
Commissioner, I need to just interject there because I do want to give Zanele an opportunity before we close our conversation, unfortunately, just to respond to this one question. Your organization, as I've mentioned, has done a lot of work in trying to hold government accountable in terms of the pieces of legislation that the Commissioner has already highlighted for us, and most importantly, what the Constitution dictates around this issue. Is there anything else that we could be doing to ensure that we find resolution on this issue and make sure that we apply enough pressure on government to start meeting some of these deadlines, specifically when it comes to those norms and standards, Zanele?
Sure. I think we have and are still doing so much to hold, government accountable because this is their constitutional obligation. And when you have young people picketing outside the Department of Education and picketing outside the Education Department, it says a lot because there is, the unresponsiveness element of, things. When we go to school visits and we chat to school communities about the issues on the ground, and then we try to bring the department into the conversation to say, listen, this is the conversation that we are having on the ground. And this is what your constituency is saying on the ground. But unfortunately, there hasn't been, responsiveness towards that. And, the last resort would be asked to go to court, would be asked to be outside, the education departments. And, that is already telling at how not accountable the government has been. And just to also add on our advocacy on the minimum uniform norms and standards for public school infrastructure is that, there is now a review of the norms. And one of the important things that we are trying to, advocate against is the removing of deadlines. Right. Because we've seen how important it is to have deadlines, and we can refer to, even in the Michael Komape court case, we are citing that, the department should have made sure that by 2016 schools have access to water and sanitation. Right. 2020, deadlines also still speak to that. And you have the next deadline that is coming, the 2023 deadline that speaks to labs and libraries. How can the department ensure that those are in schools when schools still lack your basic amenities such as water and sanitation?
Right. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and it's so sad, and it is quite unfortunate because I think it's an important discussion, but we are going to have to leave it there. That's Equal Education Head of National Organising, Zanele Modise, and Commissioner Philile Ntuli, who is with the South African Human Rights Commission, helping us to commemorate World Toilet Day.